There are moments in life when everything you've built stands on the edge of a single signature. A quiet room, a leather chair that cost more than most people earn in a year, and one piece of paper that will either end your legacy or save it. Mr. Kola Adeyemi sat alone in his office on the 43rd floor, staring at documents he never thought he'd see. Bankruptcy, liquidation, the sale of his last remaining asset, a piece of land his father had bled for, worked for, dreamed over. Outside the window, Lagos moved like it always did, unaware that one of its giants was falling. The traffic below honked and crawled through streets thick with humidity and ambition. Street vendors called out their prices. Generators hummed in the distance. Life continued, indifferent to the quiet collapse happening in this glass tower. But somewhere in that same city, in a small market stall wiped down with care every evening, a woman named Nia Okonkwo was closing her day. She counted her earnings twice, as she always did, folded the bills carefully into her purse, and said goodbye to the other vendors. She had no idea that in 72 hours, her life and his would collide in a way that would change everything. Not because she was powerful, but because she was paying attention. Stories like this don't announce themselves loudly. They unfold quietly, piece by piece. If you value stories that reward attention and patience, tap the like button now. It helps this story reach people who still believe wisdom can come from unexpected places. Kola Adeyemi was not born into wealth. He was born into hunger. His father had been a driver for a British construction firm in the 1960s, back when Nigeria was still shaking off colonial rule and trying to stand on its own feet. His mother sold groundnuts by the roadside, her hands perpetually stained with the red dust from the shells. Kola grew up watching his father come home with dust in his lungs and dignity in his spine. The man never complained, never raised his voice. He saved. He planned. He lived below his means while everyone around him spent what they didn't have. And one day, after 23 years of driving other men to their fortunes, sitting in the front seat while they made deals in the back, he bought a small plot of land on the outskirts of what would later become one of the most valuable commercial districts in West Africa. It wasn't much, just a quarter acre, overgrown with bush, no road access, no electricity. But he saw something there. Potential, a foothold, a chance to leave his children something that couldn't be taken away by a pink slip or a change in management. He didn't live to see it developed. He died of pneumonia 2 years after the purchase, leaving behind a widow, 3 children, and a faded land certificate wrapped in plastic and hidden in a tin box under the bed. Kola was 16 when his father died. He stood at the graveside in borrowed shoes that pinched his feet and made a promise that no one else heard. He promised that he would never let that land go. He would build on it. He would honor the sacrifice. He would prove that his father's faith had not been wasted. And for 30 years, he kept that promise. Adeyemi Holdings grew from a single construction contract into one of the largest private real estate firms in Nigeria. Kola was known for moving fast, thinking ahead, and trusting his instincts. He didn't waste time on long meetings or second opinions. He hired people who could execute, not people who asked too many questions. He built systems that rewarded speed, efficiency, confidence, decisiveness. It worked for decades. His company built shopping malls, office complexes, apartment towers. His name became synonymous with success. People wanted to work for him. Banks wanted to lend to him. Competitors wanted to be him. Until it didn't work anymore. The global financial downturn hit harder than anyone predicted. Projects stalled mid-construction. Investors pulled out overnight. Loans that had seemed manageable suddenly came due all at once. One by one, Kola's properties were sold to cover debts. The shopping complexes went first, then the office towers, then the luxury apartments he'd built for the new middle class. All of it gone, sold at prices below market value because there was no time to negotiate. And now, only one asset remained. The land his father had bought. The last piece. The one thing Kola had sworn he would never sell. His lawyers told him it had to be sold. There was no other way. The creditors were closing in. If he didn't sell now, they would force a public auction, and he'd get even less. The buyer was already lined up, a development group called Apex Meridian, represented by a man named Barrister Felix Dromola. Felix was smooth, polished. He wore Italian suits and gold cufflinks. He spoke in legal terms that sounded protective but felt like traps if you listened closely enough. He assured Cola the sale would be handled with dignity, that the land would be developed responsibly, that this was simply business, not betrayal. He even offered to let Cola's name remain on a small plaque at the development site, a gesture of respect for the legacy. Cola wanted to believe him. He needed to, because the alternative was admitting that everything he'd built, everything his father had died believing in, was about to disappear into the hands of strangers who would never know what that land meant. The signing was scheduled for Friday afternoon. 3 days away. Cola told no one. Not his wife, who would have tried to talk him out of it. Not his children, who had their own lives now and didn't understand what it meant to fight for inches. He carried the weight alone, the way his father had. Meanwhile, across the city, in a neighborhood where the streets flooded every rainy season and the power went out 3 times a week, Nia Okonkwo was living a completely different kind of life. She woke every morning at 4:30, before the first call to prayer echoed across the rooftops. She prepared breakfast for her 2 younger brothers, made sure their school uniforms were clean, checked their homework, and caught the first bus to the market by 5:45. She sold vegetables, tomatoes, peppers, onions, leafy greens that had to be kept damp or they'd wilt by noon. She arranged them carefully in pyramids, learned which colors caught the eye, learned how to spot the buyers who would pay full price versus those who needed a discount because their own children were hungry. She learned to read people the way some people read books. Nia had been a brilliant student once. Not just good, brilliant. She'd won a scholarship to study accounting at the University of Lagos, one of only 12 students selected from across the state. Her mother had cried when the letter arrived. Her teachers had celebrated. Her neighbors had pooled money to buy her a new backpack and a calculator. She was going to be the first person in her family to graduate from university. She was going to work in an air-conditioned office, wear professional clothes, make her mother proud. But in her second year, her mother fell ill. Cancer. The treatments were expensive. The public hospitals were overcrowded and underfunded. The private hospitals demanded payment up front. Someone had to work. Someone had to pay the bills, buy the medications, keep the household running. Her brothers were too young. Her father had left years before, gone to find work in another city, and never come back. So Nia left school, picked up her mother's market stall, and never went back. Her mother passed away 4 years later, her body worn down by a disease that might have been treatable if they'd caught it earlier, if they'd had more money, if the system had cared about women who sold vegetables for a living. Nia stayed in the market, not because she had no options. She could have reapplied to university. She could have looked for office work. But somewhere along the way, she'd stopped believing her voice mattered in rooms where decisions were made. She'd learned to be invisible, to survive quietly, to observe without interfering. The market became her world, a world where she knew the rules, where people respected her honesty, where she could control something, even if it was just the arrangement of tomatoes on a wooden table. But observation was her gift. She noticed things, patterns, inconsistencies, numbers that didn't add up. When a supplier tried to short her by 3 kilos, she knew before she even finished weighing. When a customer's child looked too thin, too quiet, she'd slip extra vegetables into the bag without charging. When a market chairman tried to raise stall fees without explanation, she was the one who asked to see the breakdown, who found the padding in the budget, who organized the other vendors to push back. She didn't do it for recognition. She did it because it needed to be done. One evening, a regular customer, Mrs. Kayamika, came to her stall looking anxious. Mrs. Kayamika worked as a cleaner at a high-rise office building downtown, one of those towers with marble lobbies and security guards in crisp uniforms. She was kind, always bought extra tomatoes to make stew for her neighbor's children, always asked about Nia's brothers, always remembered the small details of other people's lives. That evening, she was distracted. She handed Nia a 2,000 naira note for items that cost 800. Nia gave her the correct change, counting it out carefully as she always did. But Mrs. Kayamika didn't count it. She just stuffed it in her bag and sighed a deep, tired sound that came from somewhere beyond physical exhaustion. Nia asked if she was all right. Mrs. Kayamika hesitated. She looked around as if checking whether anyone was listening. Then she leaned in closer and said she'd overheard something at work that didn't sit right with her. A conversation between two men in expensive suits. Something about land documents and a clause that didn't match. Something that felt wrong even though she couldn't explain exactly why. Nia listened. She didn't push. She didn't press for details. She just created space for Mrs. Kayamika to speak. And slowly, the story came out. Mrs. Kayamika worked in the office building that housed Adeyemi Holdings. She'd been cleaning the conference room late one evening, emptying trash bins and wiping down the long glass table when two men came in. They didn't notice her. People never notice cleaners. She might as well have been furniture. One of them was Barrister Felix Duramola. The other was someone she didn't recognize, younger, nervous, carrying a leather folder. They were reviewing paperwork. She heard Felix say something about a contingency clause, about how the seller wouldn't realize the land classification had been changed on paper, how the sale would go through clean, everything above board, all the signatures in the right places. But the development rights would automatically transfer to a shell company, not to Apex Meridian. The seller would get his money. He'd walk away thinking he'd done the best he could under the circumstances. But he'd lose control. And 6 months later, when the reclassification became public, when the land was rezoned for commercial high-rise instead of mixed-use development, the land would be flipped for 3 times the sale price. Mrs. Kayamika didn't understand all of it. The legal terms were confusing, but she understood deception. She understood the tone in Felix's voice, the casual confidence of a man who knew he was taking advantage of someone's desperation. She told Nia, because Nia was the only person she knew who listened without judgment, who didn't dismiss things just because they came from a cleaner. Nia went home that night and couldn't sleep. She lay in the small room she shared with her brothers, listening to their breathing, staring at the ceiling fan that turned slowly above her head. She didn't know Kola Adeyemi personally. She'd never been inside a building like Adeyemi Holdings. But she knew what it felt like to lose something that mattered. She knew what it felt like to be invisible while powerful people made choices that would never touch them, but would destroy you. She thought about her mother, about the hospital bills that had kept coming even after her mother died, about the fees for services that were never provided, medications that were charged twice, consultations that lasted 5 minutes but cost a week's earnings. She caught those errors. She'd fought back, and she'd won, not because the system cared, but because she'd made it impossible to ignore the numbers. She thought about staying quiet. It wasn't her business. She wasn't a lawyer. She wasn't even a university graduate anymore. Who would listen to a market woman with a story from a cleaner? What if she was wrong? What if she misunderstood? What if speaking up only brought trouble to Mrs. Kayamika, who couldn't afford to lose her job? But she also thought about her mother, about the months before she died, when the hospital bills kept coming and the doctors spoke in technical terms that were designed to confuse, not clarify. Nia had learned to read those documents. She taught herself. She'd gone to the library, borrowed medical billing books, asked questions of nurses who were willing to talk during their breaks. She caught billing errors, overcharges, duplicate treatments that were never performed, phantom consultations with specialists who never showed up. She'd save her family thousands of naira just by paying attention, just by refusing to accept that confusion was the same as correctness. And when she brought the errors to the hospital's finance office, they dismissed her at first, told her she didn't understand how medical billing worked, suggested she was being difficult, but she didn't leave. She returned with highlighted copies, with dates, with math they couldn't ignore, with witnesses who confirmed her mother had never seen certain doctors. Eventually, they refunded the money, not because they wanted to, not because they felt guilty, but because she made it impossible not to. That memory gave her courage. The next morning, Nia asked Mrs. Kayamika for any detail she could remember, for the name of the company, for anything written down. Mrs. Kayamika reached into her bag and pulled out a business card she'd found in the trash bin that night. Felix Duramola's card, Apex Meridian Legal Services. The card was expensive, embossed letters, thick stock. the kind of card that announced importance. Nia held it carefully, as if it might disappear. She thanked Mrs. Kayamika and asked her not to mention this conversation to anyone. Not yet. Not until Nia figured out what to do. Nia did something she hadn't done in years. She went to an internet cafe, paid 50 naira for 30 minutes of access, and searched for information. The connection was slow. The keyboard was sticky, but she was patient. She found articles about Adeyemi Holdings, about Kola Adeyemi's financial troubles, about how the company had been forced to sell assets, about the upcoming sale of a valuable piece of land. The articles were sympathetic but distant, written in the language of business reporters who observe collapse the way others observed weather. And then she found something else. A public record of land reclassification requests submitted to the Lagos State Ministry of Lands. The records were buried in a poorly designed government website that took forever to load. But Nia had time. She clicked through page after page until she found it. One of the requests matched the location of the property being sold. The coordinates were exact. The request had been filed 3 months earlier, long before the sale had been announced publicly. Not by Adeyemi Holdings, by a company called Crescent Ventures, a name that didn't appear anywhere in the sale documents she'd found in the news articles. She searched for Crescent Ventures. Nothing. No website. No registration. No public record beyond this single filing. A shell company. A ghost. Nia's heart was pounding. She printed everything. The land reclassification request. The articles about the sale. Felix's business card details. It cost her an extra 100 naira. Money she could have used for rice. But she knew it mattered. She walked home slowly, the folder tucked under her arm, her mind racing. She still didn't know what she was going to do with it. But she knew one thing. Silence was a choice. And she'd spent too many years choosing it. On Thursday afternoon, one day before the signing, Nia did something that terrified her. She went to the Adeyemi Holdings office building. She'd never been to that part of the city during business hours. The buildings were taller, cleaner, the people moved faster. She felt out of place in her best dress, the one she saved for church, the one with the small stain near the hem that she tried to wash out but never quite disappeared. She carried a folder with the printed documents inside. Her hands were sweating. The security guard at the entrance looked her up and down, his expression making it clear she didn't belong. He asked what her business was. She said she needed to see Mr. Adeyemi. He laughed, not meanly, but dismissively. He told her Mr. Adeyemi didn't see walk-ins. She needed an appointment. She asked how to make an appointment. He shrugged and pointed to the receptionist inside. The lobby was enormous. Marble floors. Air conditioning so cold she shivered. A fountain in the center with water that looked cleaner than what came out of her tap at home. The receptionist was young, polished, her makeup perfect. She looked at Nia the way the security guard had, like a puzzle piece from the wrong box. Nia approached the desk and said she needed to speak with Mr. Adeyemi. The receptionist asked if she had an appointment. Nia said no, but it was urgent. The receptionist smiled in that polite way that means no. She said Mr. Adeyemi's schedule was fully booked. She could leave a message. Nia said she needed to speak with him directly. It was about the land sale. The receptionist's expression didn't change. She said she'd pass along the message. Nia knew that meant the message would go nowhere. So she said she would wait. The receptionist looked uncomfortable. She said it could be hours. Nia said that was fine. She sat down in one of the leather chairs near the window. She placed the folder on her lap. And she waited. People walked past her. Employees in sharp suits, carrying briefcases and laptops. Visitors with appointments, greeted warmly by the receptionist. No one acknowledged Nia. She might as well have been invisible, which, she realized, was exactly what she'd been most of her life. An hour passed. Then two. Security approached her once, a different guard, older. He asked if she needed help finding her way out. She said she was waiting for Mr. Adeyemi. He frowned but didn't push. 3 hours. 4. Her stomach growled. She hadn't eaten since breakfast. The receptionist changed shifts. The new one didn't even ask who Nia was. Just ignored her. At 6:15 in the evening, the elevator doors opened and Kola Adeyemi walked through the lobby on his way to the parking garage. He looked exhausted. His tie was loosened. His jacket was draped over one arm. There were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there in the photographs Nia had seen online. He walked with the heaviness of a man carrying weight no one else could see. Nia stood up. Her legs were stiff from sitting. Her voice almost failed her, but she said his name, Mr. Adeyemi. He stopped, not because he recognized her, but because something in her voice made him pause. Maybe it was the tone, quiet but firm, not demanding, not begging, just certain. He turned and looked at her. Nia stepped forward. She said she needed 5 minutes, that she had information about the sale, that he needed to see something before he signed. Kola almost walked away. He heard plenty of conspiracy theories over the years. People who claimed they had inside knowledge. People who wanted money, attention, favors, partnerships. People who thought proximity to wealth could change their lives. But Nia didn't ask for anything. She just handed him the folder and said, "Please, just look." There was something in her eyes. Not desperation, not calculation, just concern. The kind of concern you see in people who care about something beyond themselves. Kola took the folder. He didn't open it right away. He asked her who she was. She told him her name. Told him she sold vegetables at Oyingbo Market. Told him a cleaner had overheard something and it didn't sit right. She explained simply, without exaggeration, exactly what Mrs. Kayamika had heard and what she'd found in the public records. Kola looked at her for a long moment. Then he opened the folder. His face changed. The exhaustion gave way to something sharper. Focus. Alarm. He flipped through the documents. The land reclassification request. The dates. The shell company. The timeline that didn't match what Felix had told him. His hands started shaking. Not a lot, but enough that Nia noticed. He looked up at her and asked where she got this. His voice was tight, controlled, but she could hear the fear underneath. She explained again, calmly, clearly, without drama. She told him about Mrs. Kayamika, about the internet cafe, about the hours she'd spent searching public records because something felt wrong. Kola's jaw clenched. He pulled out his phone and made a call. His voice was sharp now, angry. He told someone to get to the office immediately. Then he made another call, then another. Within 30 minutes, his lawyer arrived. Not Felix, his original lawyer, a woman named Adiz who had worked with Kola's father decades ago. She was in her 60s now, her hair gray, her eyes sharp behind reading glasses. She greeted Kola warmly, but her expression turned serious when she saw the documents. She sat down right there in the lobby and reviewed everything. Her expression darkened with every page. She looked up at Kola and said, "You need to halt the signing immediately. This is fraud. Clear, deliberate fraud. If you sign tomorrow, you'll lose everything. Not just the land, but the ability to fight back. Once the transaction is complete, unwinding it will take years. And by then, the land will have been flipped, the money will have disappeared into offshore accounts, and you'll be left with nothing but legal bills." Kola sat down in one of the leather chairs. He put his head in his hands. For a moment, he looked like he might cry, but he didn't. He just sat there, breathing slowly, trying to process how close he'd come to losing everything. Nia stood quietly nearby. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. After a long silence, Kola looked up at her and said, "You just saved my life." Nia shook her head. She said, "I just noticed something. That's all." But it wasn't all, and they both knew it. Kola asked for her contact information. He asked if she needed a ride home. She said no, she'd take the bus. He insisted. He had his driver take her. It was the first time Nia had ever ridden in a car that new, that clean. The seats were leather. The air conditioning worked. There was no smell of exhaust or body odor, just silence and space. She felt strange, like she'd stepped into someone else's life. That evening, Kola's legal team filed an emergency injunction to stop the sale. They submitted the documents Nia had found as evidence. They demanded a full investigation into Apex Meridian's practices and the land reclassification request. The Ministry of Lands opened an investigation that same night. By morning, the story had reached the newspapers. Felix Duramola disappeared from his office before the sun rose. His phone went straight to voicemail. His secretary said he'd taken an emergency trip. No one believed her. Apex Meridian Legal Services released a statement denying any wrongdoing, calling the allegations baseless and defamatory. But within 72 hours, 3 other victims came forward. Business owners who had sold land under similar circumstances. A retired teacher who'd lost his family's property. A widow who'd been convinced to sell at half the market value. All of them had worked with Felix. All of them had signed documents they didn't fully understand. All of them had discovered, too late, that they'd been cheated. The story broke in the national newspapers. But the coverage wasn't kind to Nia. They called her the market woman who got lucky. The cleaner's friend. The accidental hero. One headline read, "Vegetable seller stumbles into billionaire scandal." Another said, "Lucky break saves tycoon's legacy." Nia read those words on a newsstand while waiting for the bus and felt her stomach turn. She hadn't stumbled into anything. She hadn't gotten lucky. She'd made a choice. She'd spent hours researching. She'd risked looking foolish. She'd waited in a lobby for 4 hours knowing she might be dismissed. She'd acted with intention. But the world needed her to be small, to be accidental, to be anything except deliberate. The attention brought danger. 2 days after the story broke, Nia arrived at her market stall early, as she always did. She unlocked the metal shutter and found a note slipped underneath. White paper, no envelope, folded once. She opened it. 6 words, handwritten in capital letters. "You should have stayed invisible." Her hands shook as she read it. She looked around the market. Everyone was going about their day, setting up stalls, arranging goods, calling out greetings. No one seemed to notice, but someone had been watching. Someone knew where she worked. Someone wanted her afraid. She folded the note carefully and put it in her pocket. She didn't throw it away. Evidence, she thought, just in case. That night, Nia barely slept. She kept hearing footsteps outside her window, shadows that weren't there, the creak of the stairwell, the sound of a motorcycle idling too long in the street below. She thought about calling the police, but what would she say? That someone left her a note? They'd laugh. Or worse, they wouldn't care. The next week was harder. People at the market started whispering. Some admired her. They called her brave. They asked for her autograph, which felt absurd. Others resented her. One woman, a seller who'd been in the market longer than Nia, said loud enough for others to hear, "Some people don't know their place. Some people think they're better than where they come from." Nia heard it. She didn't respond, but it stung. Another vendor, a man who sold fish, stopped greeting her in the mornings. He'd always been friendly before. Now he looked away. She didn't know if he was jealous or if someone had told him to keep his distance. She felt the isolation creep in. She'd spoken up. She'd done the right thing. And now she was alone. Her brothers noticed. They asked if she was okay. She lied and said yes. But at night, when they were asleep, she sat at the small table in their kitchen and wondered if she'd made a mistake. If staying invisible would have been safer. If silence was the price of peace. But then something unexpected happened. Mrs. Kayamika came to her stall with tears in her eyes. She handed Nia an envelope. Inside was cash. 3 months' worth of salary. More money than Nia had ever held at once. Mrs. Kayamika said Mr. Adeyemi had sent it, along with a letter thanking her for her courage, for noticing, for caring, for giving him a chance to protect what mattered. The letter also included a job offer. For both of them. Nia stared at the paper for a long time. She read it 3 times to make sure she wasn't misunderstanding. The offer was real. A position in the company. Health insurance. A salary that was more than she made in 6 months of the market. Mrs. Kayamika was crying. She said she'd never imagined something like this could happen. That speaking up could lead to something good instead of punishment. Nia felt the weight lift slightly. Not completely, but enough to breathe. A week later, she met with Kola in his office. The same building she'd waited in. But this time, the receptionist smiled at her. Security waved her through. She was escorted to the 43rd floor. Kola's office was large, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. But it wasn't ostentatious. There were books on the shelves, family photos, a framed picture of an older man, his father, she guessed. Kola offered her a seat. He asked how she was doing, if the attention had been difficult. She was honest. She said yes, that some people didn't understand, that she'd received threats. Kola's expression hardened. He said he'd arrange security if she needed it. She said she'd think about it. Then he made the offer official. Compliance officer, someone who would review contracts, who would ask the questions no one else thought to ask, who would build systems to catch what he'd missed. Nia was honored, but she was also cautious. She asked him why. Why her? Why now? Kola leaned back in his chair. He said, because you saw what everyone else missed. Not because you're smarter, but because you cared enough to look twice. That's rare. Most people see what they want to see. They see what's convenient. You saw what was true. Nia thought about it. Then she said she'd accept, but on one condition. She wanted to finish her degree first. She didn't want to walk into this role unprepared. She wanted to earn it, not just be handed it because she'd gotten lucky once. Kola smiled. It was the first real smile she'd seen from him. He said he'd pay for it. Night classes, day classes, whatever she needed. Books, fees, transportation, everything. And he did. Over the next 2 years, Nia returned to university. She studied at night after work. She worked during the day, first at the market while transitioning, then part-time at Adeyemi Holdings, learning the systems, shadowing Ad's, asking endless questions. She learned to read contracts, to spot the clauses that were designed to confuse, to understand the legal language that separated protection from exploitation. She learned how power worked in rooms where decisions were made. And she learned that her voice, the one she'd spent years suppressing, had value. She graduated with honors. Her thesis was on corporate transparency and the cost of silence. It analyzed case studies of fraud that could have been prevented if someone had asked basic questions, if someone had cared enough to look twice. It was published in a national journal. Academics cited it. Corporations used it in training. Nia became known not as the market woman who got lucky, but as someone who understood systems, who understood people. Kola didn't just rebuild his company. He rebuilt his systems. He hired people who questioned, who noticed, who weren't afraid to speak. He created anonymous reporting channels. He brought in auditors who reported to an independent board, not to him. He slowed down. He built in checkpoints. He made space for doubt. Adeyemi Holdings became known not for speed, but for integrity. Clients trusted them. Investors respected them. Competitors studied them. The regulatory hearing happened 8 months after the injunction. It was held in a cold government building with stone walls that had witnessed decades of corruption and occasional justice. The room smelled like old paper and floor polish. Nia was called to testify. She sat in a wooden chair facing a panel of officials who looked at her like she was wasting their time. One of them, an older man with a thin smile and a gold watch that caught the light, asked her what made her think she had the right to interfere in a private business transaction. Nia looked him in the eye. She said, "I didn't interfere. I noticed." And noticing isn't a crime. The room went quiet. She continued. She said, "Systems reflect priorities. If we build systems that move fast but don't check, that reward confidence but not questions, we create opportunities for people to hide. I didn't save anyone. I just made it harder to hide." Her words were quoted in the final report. The panel ruled in favor of Kola. They found evidence of deliberate fraud. Felix Duramola was charged with multiple counts of fraud and forgery. Crescent Ventures was dissolved. Its assets, which were considerable, were frozen. 3 other cases were reopened. Victims were compensated. The legal process took years, but it moved forward. But the story didn't end there. 6 months later, Nia received a phone call at work. A smooth voice. Professional. Polite. The caller introduced himself as a representative from an international consulting firm. They'd read about her. They were impressed by her instincts. They wanted to hire her. The salary they quoted was 3 times what she was making. International clients. High-profile projects. Travel. Prestige. Nia asked questions. Who were the clients? What kind of work? What kind of risks would she be identifying? The answers were vague. Impressive titles. Multinational corporations. Confidential projects. Sensitive information. They couldn't say more until she signed a non-disclosure agreement. Something in her gut said no. It was the same feeling she'd had when she read Felix's documents. The feeling that something was being hidden on purpose. She asked for time to think. It said the offer wouldn't stay open long. She thanked them and hung up. She told Kola about the call. He listened carefully. Then he said, "Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is." Nia declined the offer. Politely. Firmly. She said she was committed to the work she was doing. That she valued transparency. That she wasn't interested in confidential projects she couldn't evaluate. 3 months after that, the same consulting firm was exposed in a corruption investigation in South Africa. They've been helping shell companies move money across borders, hiding assets for dictators, falsifying documents for mining companies that were destroying communities. If Nia had accepted that job, she would have been part of it. Her name would have been in the reports. Her integrity would have been compromised. Her silence, her instinct to pause, her willingness to ask questions that made people uncomfortable had saved her again. When the news broke, Kola called her into his office. He didn't say, "I told you so." He just said, "You're learning to trust yourself. That's the hardest part. Keep doing it. If you're still here, I want to ask you something. Have you ever noticed something wrong and stayed quiet because it wasn't your place? If this story is holding your attention, write 'I'm still listening' in the comments. Your voice matters more than you think." Nia's life changed, but not in the way people expected. She didn't become famous. She didn't write a memoir or start a nonprofit. She didn't give TED Talks or appear on television panels. She went back to school, earned her degree, and took the job Kola had offered. She reviewed contracts. She asked questions that made people uncomfortable. She built a team of people who'd been overlooked their entire lives. Former cleaners, security guards, receptionists, people who saw everything because no one saw them. She trained them to read documents, to spot inconsistencies, to speak up without fear. She created a culture where questions were rewarded, not punished, where doubt was seen as diligence, not disloyalty. Adeyemi Holdings didn't just survive. It became a model. Other companies began adopting similar practices. Transparency audits became standard. Whistleblower protections were strengthened. Systems that rewarded questions, not silence, spread across industries. It wasn't a revolution. It was slow, incremental, but it was real. Kola stepped back from daily operations after 5 years. He spent more time with his family. He'd missed years of his children's lives chasing deals that hadn't mattered. He visited his father's grave and told him the land was safe, that the promise had been kept, not by force, not by wealth, but by attention, by a woman who had no obligation to care, but cared anyway. 5 years after that quiet evening in the lobby, Nia stood in front of a university auditorium filled with graduating business students. She'd been invited to speak at the commencement ceremony. She wore a simple dress, nothing extravagant. She stood at the podium and looked out at the sea of faces, young people full of hope and ambition and fear. She told them her story, not as a hero, but as someone who'd made a choice. She talked about her mother, about leaving school, about the market, about the moment she could have stayed silent and chose not to. She talked about the cost of that choice, the threats, the isolation, the fear, but also about what came after, the systems that changed, the people who were protected, the culture that shifted slowly, one question at a time. She ended her speech with a question. She said, "How many opportunities to do the right thing pass by quietly, unnoticed because we convince ourselves it's not our place? How many people suffer because someone who could have spoken didn't? How many times do we choose comfort over courage, silence over truth?" The applause was long, but what stayed with her were the students who came up afterward. The ones who waited in line for 30 minutes just to shake her hand. The ones who said, "I've noticed things too. I didn't know it mattered. I thought I was being paranoid. I thought I should mind my business." She told them it didn't matter. That noticing was the first step. That caring was the second. That acting was the third. And that all three required courage. Meanwhile, the market where Nia used to work still stood. Her old stall had been taken over by a younger woman, a single mother named Chioma, who reminded Nia of herself. Chioma had 2 children, no husband, and a determination that showed in the way she arranged her vegetables and haggled with suppliers. Nia visited sometimes, not to supervise or to reminisce, but to stay connected to where she came from. She bought tomatoes. She listened. She remembered what it felt like to count every naira, to worry about school fees, to wonder if tomorrow would be harder than today. One afternoon, Chioma mentioned something strange. A landlord had been pressuring tenants in her building to sign new leases. The terms were confusing. Rent increases that didn't match the legal limits. Clauses about property improvements that the tenants would have to pay for. Maintenance fees that seemed excessive. Chioma didn't understand at all, but something felt wrong. Nia listened carefully. She asked if Chioma had a copy of the lease. Chioma did. She brought it the next day, folded and slightly stained with tomato juice. Nia reviewed it that evening at her apartment. She read it 3 times. And there it was. The same kind of trap she'd seen years before. Hidden clauses. Legal language designed to confuse. Terms that would transfer financial responsibility to tenants for repairs that were legally the landlord's obligation. Rent increases tied to vague market assessments that the landlord would control. He wasn't flying private jets or buying islands. But he retired whole. He watched his children take over parts of the company. He saw systems he'd built continue without him. He saw young employees ask questions without fear. He saw transparency become normal instead of exceptional. And he knew that the greatest thing he'd ever done wasn't building an empire. It was listening to a woman in a lobby who had no reason to care, but cared anyway. On the 10th anniversary of the day, Nia walked into his office. Kola hosted a small gathering. Not a celebration, a reflection. He invited the people who'd been part of the journey. Adiz, his lawyer, who'd helped rebuild the legal framework. Mrs. Kayamika, who still worked as a cleaner, but now also trained new employees on what to look for, what to report, how to trust their instincts. Nia's brothers, who were now a doctor and an engineer, both of whom credited their sister's sacrifice for their success. A few employees who'd learned to speak up, who'd caught errors, who'd prevented problems before they became crises. Kola stood in front of them and said something simple. He said, "I used to think power was about control, about moving fast, about being right, about never showing weakness. But I was wrong. Power is about making space for people to be seen, to be heard, to matter." That's what Nia taught me. Not by lecturing, not by demanding, but by showing up, by refusing to stay silent, by caring when it would have been easier not to. Nia stood in the back of the room. She didn't like being the center of attention. She never had, but she smiled because she knew the truth. She hadn't taught him anything. She just refused to stay silent. And that refusal had created space for others to do the same. Years later, when Nia's youngest brother graduated from medical school, he gave a speech at the ceremony. He talked about his sister, about how she'd given up her dreams so he could have his, about how she'd worked in the market every day, never complained, never asked for credit, never made him feel guilty for the opportunities she'd lost. He said, "My sister taught me that courage doesn't announce itself. It doesn't wear a cape. It doesn't make grand speeches. It just shows up, does what needs to be done, and walks away." Nia cried that day, not because of the praise, but because she realized her choices had mattered. Not just to Kola, not just to the company, not just to the tenants she'd helped or the system she'd changed, but to the people she loved most. Her brothers had futures because she'd chosen to act instead of stay silent. The market woman who noticed something no one else didn't save a billionaire. She saved a system. She saved a culture of silence. She reminded people that wisdom doesn't require a title, that integrity doesn't need an invitation, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is pay attention when everyone else has looked away. And she proved that the people society overlooks, the ones it treats as invisible, often see the most clearly, because they have nothing to gain from pretending, nothing to lose from telling the truth. They see the world as it is, not as powerful people want it to be. Nia continued her work for another 15 years. She trained hundreds of employees. She reviewed thousands of contracts. She caught dozens of potential frauds before they could harm anyone. She built a reputation not as the woman who saved a billionaire, but as someone who made systems better, who made transparency normal, who proved that asking questions wasn't a threat, it was a responsibility. When she finally retired, there was no big ceremony, just a small gathering in the office. People shared stories. They talked about the time she'd caught something they'd missed. The time she'd asked the question no one else wanted to ask. The time she'd made them better at their jobs just by expecting them to care. Kola, now in his 80s, came to the gathering. He moved slowly now, but his mind was sharp. He gave a short speech. He said, 30 years ago, I almost lost everything because I stopped asking questions. I surrounded myself with people who told me what I wanted to hear, and I almost paid the ultimate price. Nia saved me. But more than that, she taught me that the best protection against corruption isn't laws or regulations. It's people who care enough to look twice. People who value truth over comfort. People who speak up even when it costs them. After Nia retired, she didn't disappear. She volunteered at a local school, teaching financial literacy to young people. She showed them how to read contracts, how to spot scams, how to ask questions, how to trust their instincts. She told them stories, not just her own, but stories of other people who'd noticed things, who'd acted, who'd made a difference. She wanted them to know that power wasn't something you were born with or given. It was something you claimed by refusing to be silent. One of her students, a girl named Amara, who reminded Nia of herself at that age, asked her once, "Weren't you scared when you went to that office? When you spoke up?" Nia thought about it. She said, "Yes. I was terrified. I thought they'd laugh at me. I thought I'd look foolish. I thought nothing would change. But I was more scared of staying silent, of knowing I could have helped and choosing not to. That fear was worse." Amara nodded. She said, "I want to be like you when I grow up." Nia smiled. She said, "Don't be like me. Be like yourself. Just be someone who pays attention, who cares, who acts. That's all any of us can do." Years later, Amara would become a lawyer. She would specialize in tenant rights. She would represent people who couldn't afford representation. She would win cases that protected thousands of families from exploitation. And when people asked her why she did this work, she would tell them about a woman who sold vegetables and changed a system by refusing to look away. The land that started it all, the piece of property Kola's father had bought and Kola had almost lost, was never sold. Instead, it was developed into a community center, a place where people could access legal aid, financial counseling, job training. It was named after Kola's father, but there was a plaque near the entrance with another name. Nia Okonkwo, not for saving anything, but for noticing. The plaque had a quote from her commencement speech. It read, "How many opportunities to do the right thing pass by quietly, unnoticed, because we convince ourselves it's not our place." People read it every day. Some of them stopped and thought about it. Some of them asked themselves if they'd been silent when they should have spoken. Some of them made different choices because of it. And that was the real legacy. Not the headlines, not the drama, but the quiet shift in how people thought about their responsibility to each other. The understanding that noticing wasn't enough, that caring wasn't enough, that acting, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it was risky, even when it seemed like it wouldn't matter, was the only thing that created change. Nia lived to be 83. She died peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by family. Her brothers, their children, grandchildren she'd helped raise. At her funeral, the church was full, not with powerful people or celebrities, but with ordinary people whose lives she'd touched, tenants she'd helped, students she'd taught, employees she'd trained, people who'd learned from her that their voice mattered. Kola's son, who now ran Adeyemi Holdings, gave the eulogy. He talked about meeting Nia when he was young, not understanding why his father respected her so much. She was just a compliance officer, he'd thought, just someone who reviewed paperwork. But as he grew older, as he learned the business, as he saw how the company worked, he understood. She wasn't just reviewing paperwork. She was protecting people. She was building a culture where truth mattered more than convenience, where questions were valued more than silence. He ended by saying, "My father always said Nia saved his life, but she saved more than that. She saved his integrity. She saved this company. She saved the idea that business can be done honestly, that success doesn't require compromise, that power and principle can coexist. We will miss her, but we will continue her work." After the funeral, people gathered and shared stories. Mrs. Kayamika, now elderly herself, talked about the day she'd told Nia what she'd overheard. How scared she'd been. How certain she was that nothing would come of it. How Nia had listened without judgment and acted without hesitation. Chioma, the woman who'd taken over Nia's market stall, talked about the lease. About how Nia had helped her without being asked. About how that act of kindness had taught her to pay attention to others, to help when she could, to never assume that someone else would take care of problems she noticed. One by one, people share moments. Small moments. Quiet moments. Moments when Nia had noticed something and acted. When she'd asked a question that changed an outcome. When she'd made space for someone else's voice. When she'd proven that ordinary people could do extraordinary things just by refusing to look away. The stories went on for hours. And when everyone finally left, when the church was empty and quiet, the evening light coming through the stained glass windows, there was a sense not of ending, but of continuation. Because Nia's legacy wasn't a building or a plaque or a headline. It was the hundreds of people who'd learned from her example, who would notice things others missed, who would ask questions others avoided, who would act when others stayed silent. That night, across the city, in different neighborhoods, different homes, different lives, people made choices. A young accountant noticed an error in a financial report and spoke up instead of ignoring it. A teacher saw a student being bullied and intervened instead of walking past. A neighbor heard something that sounded like domestic violence and called for help instead of assuming it wasn't her business. None of them knew each other. None of them knew they were connected. But they were. They were all part of a legacy that started with one woman in a market stall who decided that silence was too expensive, that looking away was too dangerous, that staying invisible was no longer an option. This story isn't really about a billionaire or a piece of land. It's about the moment you notice something others ignore and the choice you make next. I want to hear from you. What would you have done if you were Nia? Would you have spoken or stayed silent? Share your thoughts in the comments. Someone reading them might need that courage today. And if you believe stories like this still matter, subscribe to the channel. We tell stories that stay with you long after the screen goes dark.